The funeral parlor smelled of lilies and lies. I stood beside my husband's casket, my black dress clinging to me like the suffocating grief that had consumed me for the past 3 days. Professor David Whitmore, my David, lay there looking peaceful, as if he were simply taking one of his famous afternoon naps in his leather armchair, surrounded by towers of academic papers and half-empty coffee cups. Our twins, Emma and Michael, flanked me on either side. At 17, they were trying so hard to be strong, their young faces masks of composure that I recognized as inherited from their father. Emma clutched my hand with the fierce grip of someone afraid I might disappear too, while Michael stood ramrod straight, his jaw clenched in that stubborn way that reminded me painfully of David. The university had turned out in force. Colleagues from the English literature department filed past, offering condolences that blurred together in a symphony of "he was a great man" and "such a loss to academia." Students, both current and former, wiped away tears as they shared memories of Professor Whitmore's passionate lectures on Victorian literature and his legendary ability to make even the most reluctant freshman fall in love with Dickens. I had been Mrs. David Whitmore for 22 years. We had built a life together, a beautiful home on Maple Street with the wraparound porch he'd always dreamed of, 2 brilliant children who were our pride and joy, and what I had believed was an unshakable marriage built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and deep love. David was my anchor, my intellectual equal, my best friend. The sudden heart attack that took him at 55 had shattered not just my heart, but my entire understanding of who I was. As I accepted yet another embrace from one of David's colleagues, I caught sight of a young woman standing near the back of the room. She was perhaps 25, with long auburn hair and the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged in a pre-Raphaelite painting, exactly the type David had always admired in art. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to look more elegant than my expensive designer mourning attire. What struck me wasn't her beauty, but her grief. She stood apart from the other mourners, tears streaming silently down her face, with an intimacy that made something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't the polite sorrow of a respectful student or colleague. This was the raw, unguarded anguish of someone who had lost something precious. I watched as she approached the casket, and my breath caught when she placed her hand gently on the polished wood, her lips moving in what appeared to be a private goodbye. The gesture was tender, familiar, and utterly inappropriate for a student paying respects to a professor. "Mom?" Emma's voice cut through my growing unease. "Who is that woman?" Before I could answer, the young woman turned and began walking toward us. Her steps were deliberate, her chin raised with a confidence that seemed at odds with her tears. As she drew closer, I could see that her green eyes were rimmed with red, but burning with something I couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Her voice was soft but clear, cultured in a way that spoke of good breeding and expensive education. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm Sophia Chen. I was very close to your husband." The way she said "very close" sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Emma and Michael exchanged glances, clearly picking up on the same undercurrent I was sensing. "I don't believe we've met," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "How did you know David?" "I was his student," she said, and then, with devastating simplicity, added, "And for the past 3 years, I was his partner, his companion. We lived together as husband and wife in every way that mattered, except legally." The funeral parlor seemed to tilt around me. The conversations of other mourners became a distant hum as her words echoed in my ears. Emma gasped audibly, and I felt Michael's body go rigid beside me. "I'm sorry," I said, certain I had misheard. "What did you say?" Sophia's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I know this must be difficult to hear, especially now. David struggled with how to tell you. He never wanted to hurt you or the children, but he couldn't deny what we had found together. He was going to ask for a separation after Michael and Emma graduated. We had plans." Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like incense, heavy, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. "You're lying." Michael's voice cracked with the force of his denial. "You're some delusional student who—" "I'm not lying," Sophia interrupted gently. "And I'm not delusional. I have David's house key in my purse. I know he keeps his reading glasses in the drawer of his nightstand, along with the bottle of antacids he thought he was hiding from Margaret because he didn't want her to worry about his stress. I know about the scar on his shoulder from when he fell off his bike as a child, and about the recurring nightmare he had about forgetting to grade final exams. Each detail she recited was like a physical blow. These were intimate things, private things, that only someone very close to David would know. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I gripped Emma's hand tighter. "I have legal documents," Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength. David wanted to make sure I would be taken care of if anything happened to him. He never imagined. We both thought we had more time. The funeral director appeared at my elbow, his professional smile not quite masking his discomfort at the scene unfolding in his establishment. "Mrs. Whitmore, we'll be beginning the service in just a few minutes. Perhaps you'd like to take your seats?" I nodded numbly, grateful for the interruption. But as I turned to guide Emma and Michael toward the front row of chairs reserved for family, Sophia's voice stopped me cold. "I'll be sitting in the family section as well," she said quietly. David would have wanted that. I turned back to face her, and for the first time since her shocking revelation, I felt a flicker of the woman I had been before grief had hollowed me out. "You most certainly will not. This is a funeral for a husband and father. You, whatever you were, have no place in the family section." Something flickered across Sophia's face. Disappointment, perhaps, or hurt. But it was quickly replaced by a steely determination that reminded me uncomfortably of David when he had made up his mind about something. "I understand this is painful for you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded document. But David made his wishes very clear. I am his designated beneficiary and the person he chose to handle his affairs. I have every right to be here. As she handed me the paper, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Whatever else she might be, she wasn't unaffected by this confrontation. But that small comfort was immediately overshadowed by what I saw when I unfolded the document. It was a power of attorney, dated 6 months ago, designating Sophia Chen as David's legal representative in all matters. His signature was unmistakably his. I had seen it thousands of times on birthday cards, mortgage papers, and Christmas presents. But seeing it on this document, giving away his life to another woman, felt like discovering his body all over again. "This can't be real," I whispered. "I'm afraid it is," Sophia replied, her voice now carrying a note of authority that hadn't been there moments before. "And there's more. David's will, his insurance policies, the house deed, he made provisions, significant provisions." The room was spinning now, and I felt Emma's arm around my waist, supporting me. Through the haze of shock, I heard Michael's voice, tight with controlled rage. "You're vultures, both of you, coming here on the day of his funeral to—" "I loved him," Sophia cut him off, and for the first time since she'd approached us, her composure cracked. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I loved him more than anything in this world. He was my everything, and now he's gone. And I have to face the fact that the only family he has left sees me as the enemy." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup, and suddenly she looked younger, more vulnerable. "I didn't want it to happen this way. David didn't want it to happen this way. But it has, and we all have to deal with it." The funeral director cleared his throat pointedly, and I realized that other mourners were beginning to take their seats, casting curious glances in our direction. The last thing David would have wanted was a scene at his own funeral. "We'll discuss this later," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "After the service, after we've buried him with the dignity he deserves." Sophia nodded, seeming to recognize that she had pushed as far as she could for now. She moved toward the family section, and despite every instinct screaming at me to stop her, I let her go. The legal document in my hand felt like it was burning my fingers. As the service began, I found myself sitting 3 seats away from the woman who claimed to have been sharing my husband's bed for 3 years. The minister spoke beautifully about David's contributions to literature and education, about his devotion to his family, about the legacy he left behind. But all I could think about was how thoroughly I had been living a lie. Every late night he'd claimed to be grading papers. Every conference he'd attended alone because it would be boring for you, Margaret. Every time he'd seemed distracted or distant, and I'd attributed it to work stress or middle-age melancholy. It had all been her, all of it. As they lowered David's casket into the ground, I watched Sophia throw in a single red rose and whisper something I couldn't hear. Emma and Michael stood close to me, my children united in their confusion and anger. But I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the realization that I had been living with a stranger. The man I thought I knew, the man I had built my life around, had been capable of constructing and maintaining an elaborate deception for years. If I had been so wrong about David, what else in my life had been an illusion? As the mourners began to disperse, Sophia approached us one final time. The vulnerability I had glimpsed earlier was gone, replaced by a businesslike determination that chilled me. "I'll give you a week," she said quietly, so only we could hear. "A week to process this and to make arrangements. Then we need to discuss the practical matters, the house, David's belongings, his finances. I don't want to be cruel, but David left very specific instructions about how he wanted things handled. Instructions about what? Emma demanded, her young voice fierce with protective anger. Sophia looked at my daughter with something that might have been pity. About everything, sweetheart. Your father left me in charge of everything. And with that, she walked away, leaving us standing beside David's grave with a pile of dirt and a mountain of questions that would never be answered. That night, as I sat in my living room, staring at the power of attorney document for the 100th time, I realized that David's death wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of the life I thought I had been living. The real nightmare was just beginning. 3 days after the funeral, Sophia Chen stood on my front porch with a locksmith and what appeared to be half the legal system of our small college town. The morning sun cast her auburn hair in an almost angelic light, which seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said when I opened the door, her voice professionally courteous but firm. "I tried calling, but you weren't answering your phone." I hadn't been answering anyone's calls. The house had been filled with casseroles and condolences for days, but I'd finally reached my limit and stopped responding to the doorbell, the phone, and the well-meaning neighbors who wanted to help me process my grief. What I was processing was far more complicated than simple bereavement. "What do you want, Sophia?" I asked, not bothering to hide my exhaustion. Emma and Michael had gone back to school that morning, their first day since the funeral, and I had been looking forward to being alone with my thoughts for the first time in a week. She gestured to the elderly locksmith standing behind her, who was studying his clipboard with the intense focus of someone trying to pretend he wasn't witnessing a domestic crisis. Beside him stood a young man in an expensive suit who screamed, "Lawyer," from his perfectly pressed tie to his leather briefcase. "I'm here to take possession of the house," Sophia said, her words falling like stones in the quiet morning air. David's will was very specific about his wishes, and the probate court has expedited the process given the clear documentation of his intentions. The lawyer stepped forward, extending his hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a threat. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm James Morrison, Ms. Chen's attorney. I want to assure you that we're going to handle this as sensitively as possible, given the circumstances." I stared at him, then at Sophia, then at the locksmith who was now actively avoiding eye contact. "Handle what, exactly?" Sophia pulled a manila folder from her oversized handbag and handed it to me. "David's will, the property deed transfer, insurance beneficiary documents. He was very thorough in his planning." My hands shook as I opened the folder. The first document was David's last will and testament, dated 8 months ago. I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. The house, our house, where we had raised our children, where we had celebrated anniversaries and Christmas mornings, was left entirely to Sophia Chen, not just David's half of the property, but the entirety of it. "This is impossible," I whispered. "We owned this house jointly. He can't just— Actually, he can," the lawyer interrupted gently. "Professor Whitmore refinanced the property 6 months ago and removed your name from the deed. Legally, the house belonged entirely to him at the time of his death." The world tilted. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "That's not— We would have had to sign papers together." "I would have known." Sophia's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, she looked like the grieving young woman from the funeral rather than the legal adversary standing on my porch. "David said he told you it was just routine paperwork for a better interest rate. You signed a quitclaim deed." Memory hit me like a physical blow. 3 months ago, David had come home with a stack of papers explaining that our mortgage company was offering an incredible refinancing deal, but they needed to move quickly. I had signed without reading, trusting him completely, as I had for 22 years. He had even joked about how much he appreciated having a wife who trusted him with the boring financial details. "He lied to me," I said, "more to myself than to them." "He was protecting his assets," Morrison corrected. "Professor Whitmore was facing some significant financial pressures that he didn't want to impact your credit or future security. By transferring the property, he ensured that his personal obligations wouldn't affect your ability to start fresh." "Personal obligations?" I repeated. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. "David had some debts, academic conferences, research expenses, gifts." She trailed off, but I understood. The gifts had been for her. "The life insurance policy has also been changed," Morrison continued, apparently deciding to deliver all the bad news at once. "Ms. Chen is the primary beneficiary of the $500,000 policy. There is a smaller policy, $50,000, that remains in your name." I felt like I was drowning. The house, the insurance, the savings we had built together, all of it was going to the woman who had destroyed my marriage without me even knowing there was a war being fought. My children, I said, grasping for something solid to hold on to. Their college funds, their trust accounts, remain intact, Morrison assured me. Professor Whitmore was very careful to protect the children's interests. The college funds he established for Emma and Michael are untouched. It was a small mercy, but it felt enormous in that moment. David might have betrayed me in every other way, but he hadn't abandoned his children entirely. However, Sophia said, her voice gentle but inexorable, the house needs to be vacated. I'm willing to give you 30 days to make arrangements, which is more generous than the legal requirement. Generous, I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the word. The locksmith cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you could just step aside. I need to change the locks as directed by the court order. Court order? Morrison handed me another document. Given that Ms. Chen now owns the property and has legal authority over Professor Whitmore's estate, the court has granted her request for immediate possession. This is all very standard in cases where property has been clearly bequeathed. I looked down at the papers in my hands. Legal documents that were dismantling my life with surgical precision. David's signature was on every single one, authorizing the destruction of everything we had built together. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, hating the plaintive note in my own voice. There's a nice apartment complex about 10 minutes from the university, Sophia offered. David mentioned that you might like it there. Smaller space, less maintenance, more suitable for a single woman starting over. The casual way she referenced conversations she'd had with my husband about my future living arrangements was almost more than I could bear. They had discussed where I would live after he left me. They had planned my exile. I need to call Emma and Michael, I said. They need to know. Of course, Morrison said. But the locksmith does need to complete his work today. Ms. Chen has been patient, but she has her own timeline to consider. I wanted to scream at him that Sophia Chen could consider my timeline for once, but I realized the futility of it. She held all the cards, legal, financial, and apparently emotional. David had given her everything and left me with nothing but the bitter knowledge of my own naivety. As I stepped aside to let the locksmith begin his work, Sophia touched my arm gently. Margaret, Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to know that I never wanted it to happen this way. David was going to handle all of this differently. He was going to explain everything to you and the children. He was going to make sure everyone was taken care of. But instead, he died and left you to do his dirty work, I said, shrugging off her touch. She flinched, as if I had slapped her. He left me to carry out his wishes, yes, but also to live with the consequences of decisions I didn't make. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I looked at Sophia, really looked at her. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Her hands were shaking slightly, and despite her composed demeanor, she looked as lost as I felt. You're 25 years old, I said suddenly. 26 next month, she corrected. You're a child. He was 55. You could have been his daughter. Color flamed in her cheeks. Age is just a number when two people connect intellectually and emotionally. David and I shared something profound, a meeting of minds that transcended conventional social expectations. It was a pretty speech, probably one David had fed her to justify their relationship to herself, but I heard the defensiveness underneath it, the need to legitimize what anyone else would see as a middle-aged professor taking advantage of a young student. How long? I asked. How long what? How long were you his student before you became his whatever you were? She looked away. I was in his Victorian literature seminar my junior year. We connected over a paper I wrote on Christina Rossetti. So you were 22 or 23 when it started. Still a teenager when he first noticed you. It wasn't like that, she said quickly. Nothing inappropriate happened while I was his student. We didn't become involved until after I graduated. But he was grooming you, I said, the pieces falling into place. All those office hours, all that special attention to your brilliant insights into poetry. He was grooming you. Morrison stepped between us, clearly sensing that the conversation was heading toward dangerous territory. Perhaps we should focus on the practical matters at hand, he suggested. But I was past caring about practical matters. 22 years of marriage, and my husband had been seducing students. Not just Sophia. How could I know she was the first? How could I know she would be the last? Did he do this with others? I asked her directly. No, she said, but she answered too quickly and wouldn't meet my eyes. Did he? I don't know, she admitted. We didn't talk about his past relationships. Because she didn't want to know, I realized. She wanted to believe she was special, the one true love of a distinguished older man. She wanted to believe in the fairy tale he had sold her. The locksmith finished installing the new deadbolt and handed Sophia a set of keys. The sound of those keys jingling in her palm was like a death knell for the life I had known. I'll need to get some things, I said. Clothes, photographs, personal items. Of course, Morrison said. Miss Chen is willing to accommodate a reasonable retrieval of personal belongings. My piano, I said suddenly. My grandmother's piano. Sophia's face fell. David loved that piano. He said it was where he did his best thinking, listening to you play Chopin in the evenings. The casual intimacy with which she referenced my private moments with David felt like a violation. It was my grandmother's, I repeated. It doesn't belong to him or to you. If you can provide documentation of separate ownership, Morrison began. It's a family heirloom, I interrupted. I've had it since before David and I were married. Sophia looked genuinely conflicted. I don't want to keep something that belongs to your family. But David specifically mentioned the piano in his personal effects list. He wanted me to have the things that reminded him of home. The things that reminded him of home. Not the wife who had played for him every evening for 2 decades, but the piano itself. I was replaceable, but the music was not. Fine, I said, too emotionally exhausted to fight over furniture. Keep it. Keep everything. But I want you to know that every time you look at that piano, every time you hear those songs, you'll be living in the shadow of the life he had before you. You'll be playing house in another woman's home, sleeping in another woman's bed, living another woman's life. Sophia's composure finally cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she looked every bit as young and lost as she actually was. I loved him, she whispered. I loved him so much, and now he's gone, and everyone hates me, and I don't know how to be without him. Despite everything she had done to me, despite the devastation she represented, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She was grieving too, in her own way. David had left both of us to deal with the consequences of his choices, but sympathy was a luxury I couldn't afford. You'll figure it out, I said, stepping back into the house that was no longer mine. You have everything he left behind to comfort you. All I have are questions that will never be answered. As I climbed the stairs to pack the remnants of my life into suitcases, I heard Sophia and her lawyer discussing practical matters, utility transfers, mail forwarding, property management. The sounds of my life being efficiently dismantled drifted up through the floorboards. When Emma and Michael came home from school that afternoon, I was waiting for them with packed bags and the devastating news that we no longer had a home. The extended stay. America on Route 9 smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. For 3 weeks, my children and I had been living in adjoining rooms that cost more per night than our old mortgage payment, surviving on takeout and the suffocating weight of our new reality. Emma had stopped speaking to me entirely, as if somehow this disaster was my fault. She spent her days at school and her evenings locked in the bathroom, crying into towels so Michael and I wouldn't hear her. Michael, on the other hand, had channeled his grief and rage into a cold, frightening anger that reminded me too much of David when he was disappointed. We should contest the will, he said for the 100th time, pacing the narrow strip of carpet between the 2 double beds. There has to be something illegal about what she did. People can't just steal houses from widows and orphans. We're not orphans, Emma said from her position curled up on the far bed, her voice muffled by pillows. We're just homeless. I sat at the small round table by the window, surrounded by legal documents I'd been studying obsessively. In the 3 weeks since Sophia had taken possession of our house, I'd learned more about estate law than I'd ever wanted to know. The bitter truth was that everything she had done was completely legal. Your father was very thorough, I said, not for the first time. Every signature is legitimate. Every document was properly notarized and filed. His lawyer, his other lawyer, not Morrison, confirmed that David came to him 6 months ago specifically to restructure his estate. But why? Emma finally looked up, her 17-year-old face ravaged by confusion and loss. Why would Dad do this to us? Why would he want us to have nothing? It was the question that haunted me every sleepless night in this sterile hotel room. I had been married to David for 22 years, and I still couldn't understand how the man who had held my hand during Emma's difficult birth, who had coached Michael's Little League team, who had slow danced with me in our kitchen on random Tuesday nights, could have systematically planned our destruction. I don't think he wanted us to have nothing, I said carefully. I think he was planning to divorce me after you 2 graduated, and he wanted to protect his assets. From what? Michael demanded. You never asked for anything. You supported his career, you raised his children, you managed his house. What did you ever do that he needed to protect himself from? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was that I had done nothing wrong. My crime had been getting older. At 48, I was no longer the 26-year-old graduate student who had fallen in love with her charming professor. I had wrinkles around my eyes and silver threads in my brown hair. I had stretch marks from carrying his children and a softer body from years of prioritizing everyone's needs above my own. Sophia Chen was 26 now, exactly the age I had been when David and I had met. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental. My phone buzzed with another text from my sister Linda in Boston. She had been calling daily since the funeral, offering us her spare bedroom and increasingly frantic suggestions about lawyers and private investigators. I had been putting her off, too proud to admit the full extent of our situation, but pride was a luxury we could no longer afford. I think we need to go to Boston, I said suddenly. Both children looked up at me. It was the first decisive statement I'd made since this nightmare began. Aunt Linda has been asking us to stay with her, I continued. Michael, you could finish your senior year at Boston Latin. Emma, you could transfer to— No. Michael's voice was flat and final. I'm not running away. I'm not letting that bitch steal our lives and then slinking off to Massachusetts like a beaten dog. Michael, she was his student, Mom. His student. Don't you think that's worth something to the university? Don't you think they'd care that Professor David Whitmore was sleeping with his students? I had thought about that, actually. But Sophia had graduated before their relationship became physical, or so she claimed, and David was beyond the reach of professional consequences now. Even if the university cared, it wouldn't change anything legally, I said. The will stands. The house is hers. Then we make her life hell, Michael said with a viciousness that scared me. We make her understand that actions have consequences. We are not going to harass a grieving young woman, I said firmly. Grieving? Emma sat up, her eyes blazing with the first real emotion I'd seen from her in days. She's grieving? What about us, Mom? What about our grief? She gets to grieve in our house, sleeping in Dad's bed, probably wearing your clothes and playing your piano. And we get to grieve in a hotel room that smells like other people's sadness. She wasn't wrong. I had driven by the house twice, unable to stop myself from checking on the home where I'd spent half my life. Both times, I'd seen lights on in the evening, the warm yellow glow spilling from windows that had once framed my own silhouette. Sophia was living my life with an ease that felt obscene. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Whitmore? This is Detective Sarah Reeves with the University Police. I was wondering if we could set up a time to talk. My blood went cold. Is this about David? In a way, yes. We've received some concerning information about Professor Whitmore's relationship with students. I'd prefer to discuss it in person, if that's possible. I looked at Emma and Michael, who were watching me with growing alarm. What kind of concerning information? The type that suggests your husband's relationship with Ms. Chen might not have been as unique as she's claimed. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock? After I hung up, the hotel room felt even smaller than before. Emma and Michael peppered me with questions I couldn't answer, their excitement palpable. Maybe finally we had found a crack in Sophia's perfect legal armor. If Dad was having affairs with multiple students, that changes things, right? Michael asked. That has to be some kind of fraud or coercion. I don't know, I said honestly, but we're going to find out. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the young woman who had stood beside my husband's casket, crying with the abandon of someone who believed herself to be the great love of his life. If Detective Reeves was right, if there had been others, then Sophia was as much a victim of David's deception as I was. The next morning, I sat in Detective Reeves's cramped office in the basement of the administration building, drinking bitter coffee from a paper cup and learning that the man I had married was a stranger. We've had 3 women come forward since Professor Whitmore's funeral, Reeves said, consulting her notes. All former students, all describing relationships that began during their junior or senior years and continued after graduation. The pattern is remarkably consistent. She handed me a manila folder. These are their statements. I should warn you, they're difficult to read. The first statement was from Jennifer Walsh, class of 2018. She described a relationship that had lasted 2 years, ending abruptly when David told her he needed to focus on his family. She had believed herself to be the love of his life until she saw Sophia Chen at the funeral and recognized the same desperate grief in another woman's eyes. The second statement was from Amanda Torres, class of 2016. Her story was nearly identical. The special attention in class, the private conferences that turned personal, the graduation that marked the beginning of a secret relationship. David had promised her he was going to leave his wife, had made plans for their future together, had given her a key to an apartment he was supposedly renting for when he moved out of the family home. The third statement was from Rebecca Kim, class of 2014. She had been involved with David for 3 years, convinced that she was his only extramarital relationship. The affair had ended when she started asking too many questions about when he was going to divorce me. "There may be others," Detective Reeves said gently. "These are just the ones brave enough to come forward so far." I stared at the statements, my hands shaking. "How many?" I whispered. "We don't know yet. But based on the pattern, we suspect Professor Whitmore was involved with at least one student from every graduating class for the past 15 years, possibly longer. 15 years. Emma was 17. Michael was 17. David had been cheating on me since before my children were old enough to understand what marriage meant. "Did Sophia know?" I asked. "About the others? We don't think so. From what we can gather, Professor Whitmore was very careful to keep his relationships compartmentalized. Each woman believed she was special, the one true exception to his marriage." I thought about Sophia's reaction when I'd asked if there had been others. Her too quick denial followed by uncertainty. She had suspected, maybe, but hadn't wanted to know for sure. "What does this mean for the will?" I asked. "For the house?" Detective Reeves leaned back in her chair. "That's not really my area of expertise, but I can tell you that Professor Whitmore's behavior raises serious questions about his judgment and mental state. A pattern of serial infidelity combined with the financial manipulation of his estate. Well, it might be worth having a lawyer look at whether he was acting in his right mind when he made those final decisions." For the first time in a month, I felt something that might have been hope. "There's something else," Reeves continued. "The timing of some of Professor Whitmore's financial decisions corresponds with periods when he was under significant stress. According to his medical records, which we were able to access as part of the investigation, he was prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication multiple times over the past 2 years. "I didn't know that," I said, stunned. "He never told me he was taking medication. The prescriptions were filled at a pharmacy across town, not your usual family pharmacy, and they were prescribed by Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychiatrist who specializes in treating professionals facing career crises." My mind raced. Career crises? Apparently, Professor Whitmore was concerned about potential exposure of his relationships with students. He was seeing Dr. Harper for help managing anxiety and depression related to fear of professional and personal consequences. The pieces were beginning to form a picture I didn't like. David hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been spiraling, medicating his guilt and fear while making increasingly desperate decisions to protect himself from the consequences of his actions. Was he mentally competent when he signed the will and the property transfers? "That's the million-dollar question," Detective Reeves said. According to Dr. Harper's notes, Professor Whitmore was experiencing significant psychological distress in the months before his death. Whether that distress impaired his capacity to make sound legal decisions is something a court would have to determine. I left the university police station with copies of the statements and a referral to a lawyer who specialized in challenging wills on the grounds of mental incapacity. For the first time since David's funeral, I felt like I had weapons to fight back with. When I returned to the hotel, Emma and Michael were waiting for me with barely contained excitement. "Well?" Michael demanded before I'd even closed the door. I sat down on the bed and told them everything. About the other women, about David's medication, about the possibility that his final legal decisions had been made while he was psychologically compromised. "So we can get the house back?" Emma asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. "Maybe," I said, "but it's going to be a long fight, and it's going to get ugly. Everything about your father's life is going to be examined. Every lie, every affair, every secret. Are you prepared for that?" They looked at each other, these children who had been forced to grow up too quickly, and I saw David's determination in both their faces. "Yes," Michael said simply. "We're ready." Emma nodded. "We want our life back, Mom, whatever it takes." That evening, I called the lawyer Detective Reeves had recommended and scheduled an appointment for the following day. Then I called my sister Linda and told her we were staying in town to fight. Finally, I did something I hadn't done since the day of David's funeral. I called Sophia Chen. "Hello, Margaret," she said, her voice wary. "I think we need to talk," I said. "There are some things about David that you need to know. Things that might change how you see our situation." There was a long pause. "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggest neither of us really knew the man we both loved." Sophia agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory away from the house that had become the epicenter of our conflict. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a mug as if she were trying to absorb its warmth. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, wearing an oversized sweater that made her seem younger than her 26 years. "Thank you for coming," I said, sliding into the chair across from her. She nodded but didn't speak, her green eyes wary and red-rimmed. Up close, I could see that the past month hadn't been kind to her either. There were shadows under her eyes, and she had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. "You look tired," I said. "I haven't been sleeping well," she admitted. It's very quiet at night. Every sound makes me think." She trailed off, then looked at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. "I keep expecting him to come home." Despite everything she had done to my family, I felt a stab of sympathy. She was grieving too, and grief was a terrible thing to bear alone in someone else's house. "Sophia," I began carefully, "when you were with David, did he ever mention other women? Other relationships?" Her back straightened defensively. "Of course not. David wasn't that kind of man. He was faithful to you for 20 years before he met me, and he was faithful to me after." I pulled out the folder Detective Reeves had given me and placed it on the table between us. "I need you to read these." She stared at the manila folder as if it might bite her. "What is it?" "Statements from 3 other women, 3 other former students who had relationships with David." The color drained from her face. "That's not— David told me I was the only one. He said he had never felt this way about anyone before, that what we had was unique." "Read them," I said gently. With trembling hands, she opened the folder and began reading Jennifer Walsh's statement. I watched her face as the familiar story unfolded. The special attention in class, the private conferences, the promises of a future together. By the time she reached Amanda Torres's nearly identical account, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "No," she whispered, pushing the folder away. "This isn't— These women are lying. They're jealous because David chose me, left everything to me." "Sophia, look at the dates. Jennifer graduated in 2018, Amanda in 2016, Rebecca in 2014. David was having relationships with all of you simultaneously." She shook her head violently. "David loved me. He was going to leave Margaret for me. He had already made all the arrangements. He made the same promises to all of them." I interrupted. "He gave Amanda a key to an apartment he never intended to move to. He told Rebecca he was filing divorce papers that were never filed. He told Jennifer he was just waiting for his children to graduate." Sophia stared at the statements, her world crumbling as visibly as mine had at David's funeral. "But the will," she said desperately, "the house, the insurance, he left it all to me." "Because you were the current one," I said, not unkindly. "The most recent in a long line of young women who believed they were special." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I reached across the table and touched her arm gently. "Sophia, I need you to understand something. We were both victims of the same man. David was a predator who used his position of authority to manipulate vulnerable young women. The fact that you were the last doesn't make you less of a victim. It just makes you the one left holding the bag when he died." She looked up at me through her tears. "But I loved him. I loved him so much. I know you did. And I believe he cared for you, in his way. But Sophia, love built on lies isn't real love. It's obsession, manipulation, fantasy. David sold you a dream that was never going to come true. The other women," she said slowly, Do they hate me? They don't know about you specifically, but they're angry. They feel used, betrayed. They've been carrying the guilt and shame of affairs they thought were love stories, and now they're finding out they were just entries in David's personal catalog of conquests." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, processing this new reality. When she spoke again, her voice was small and broken. "What do you want from me?" This was the moment I had been building toward. The moment when I stopped being a victim and became an advocate for my own future. "I want you to help me prove that David was not mentally competent when he made his final legal decisions," I said. "I want you to tell a court about his behavior in the months before he died, about his anxiety, his medication, his increasingly erratic choices." Her eyes widened. "You want to contest the will. I want to get my life back, my children's lives back. And I want to make sure David can't hurt any more young women from beyond the grave. But if the will is overturned, I lose everything. You lose things that were never rightfully yours to begin with," I said firmly. "Sophia, you're 26 years old. You have a master's degree in literature and your whole life ahead of you. I'm 48 with 2 teenagers to support and no career because I spent 20 years supporting David's ambitions instead of my own. Who deserves a second chance more?" She flinched at my bluntness, but I pressed on. "And there's something else you need to consider. If David was medicating anxiety about his relationships with students, if he was spiraling mentally, then his death might not have been as natural as everyone assumed. What do you mean? Heart attacks can be triggered by extreme stress, anxiety, guilt. If David was taking psychiatric medication without telling his cardiologist, if he was self-medicating with alcohol or other substances to cope with his fear of exposure, he might have inadvertently contributed to his own death. Sophia went very still. Are you saying David killed himself? I'm saying that a man who was systematic enough to restructure his entire estate to hide his affairs from his family was also systematic enough to research what might happen if those affairs came to light. I'm saying that David's final months were spent in a state of psychological crisis that impaired his judgment and may have contributed to his death. You can't prove that. Maybe not. But I can prove that he was on medication that affects cognitive function. I can prove that he was seeing a psychiatrist for anxiety and depression. I can prove that his financial decisions in the final months of his life were increasingly erratic and self-destructive. And with your help, I can prove that his relationship with you was part of a pattern of behavior that suggests serious mental instability. Sophia sat back in her chair, looking overwhelmed. You want me to testify against David, to help you destroy his reputation. I want you to tell the truth about what your relationship was really like. I want you to acknowledge that David was not the stable, rational man who appears on those legal documents. And if I don't, I leaned forward, my voice hardening, then I'll fight you anyway. I'll drag every sordid detail of David's secret life into court. I'll call Jennifer and Amanda and Rebecca as witnesses. I'll subpoena his medical records and his pharmacy records. I'll examine every financial transaction he made in the past 5 years. And when I'm done, David's reputation will be destroyed anyway, but you'll still be seen as the homewrecker who stole a widow's house. Her face went pale. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice. You can work with me to get justice for all of David's victims, including yourself, or you can fight me and lose everything anyway. Because, Sophia, I promise you this. I am not going to disappear quietly into the night. I am not going to let my children grow up believing their father abandoned them for a woman young enough to be his daughter. And I am not going to live the rest of my life in poverty because my husband decided to trade in his middle-aged wife for a newer model. Something in my voice must have convinced her that I was serious because she suddenly looked frightened. Margaret, I never wanted to hurt you or the children. David said you would be fine, that you were strong enough to start over. David said a lot of things that weren't true, I replied. The question is, are you going to keep living his lies, or are you going to help me expose them? She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup as if it held answers. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clearer than they had been since I'd sat down. What would I have to do? Tell the truth about David's medication, his mood swings, his paranoia about being discovered. Tell the court about the nights he couldn't sleep, the times he seemed disconnected from reality, the way he changed in those final months. He was scared, she admitted quietly. Terrified that someone would find out about us, about the others he was starting to remember. He kept saying he had to protect me, had to make sure I would be taken care of if anything happened to him. He wasn't protecting you, Sophia. He was protecting himself. He restructured his estate to hide his assets from me because he knew that when the truth came out, and it always comes out, I would have legal grounds to claim adultery and misconduct in any divorce proceedings. She nodded slowly, the final pieces falling into place. He used me. He used all of us, I said. But we don't have to let him continue using us from the grave. Sophia closed the folder of statements and pushed it back toward me. I need time to think. You have 24 hours, I said, standing up. After that, I'm filing the contestation with or without your cooperation. As I walked away, I heard her call my name. I turned back to see her standing beside the table, looking young and lost and utterly defeated. Margaret, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for all of it. I really believed he loved me. He probably did, I said, in the only way he was capable of loving anyone, selfishly, possessively, and temporarily. But love that destroys other people isn't love at all. It's just another form of abuse. That evening, I sat in the hotel room with Emma and Michael, reviewing my notes and preparing for the legal battle ahead. My children watched me with something approaching awe as I organized documents and made lists of witnesses and evidence. Mom, Emma said quietly, you're different. Different how? Stronger, scarier, like you could take on the world and win. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful young woman who looked so much like I had at her age, and I realized she was right. Something fundamental had shifted in me during that conversation with Sophia. The grieving widow was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone who was tired of being a victim. Maybe I could, I said. Maybe it's time I tried. Michael grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the funeral. Are we really going to get our house back? We're going to try, I said. "And if we can't get the house back, we're going to make sure David's victims get justice. All of them." My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "I'll testify. You're right. We were all victims. It's time to stop protecting a dead man's reputation and start protecting ourselves." I smiled, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: power. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one making the decisions. I was the one in control. David had made the mistake of thinking I would go quietly. He was about to learn, even in death, that he had seriously underestimated the woman he had betrayed. The courtroom in downtown Hartford was smaller than I had expected, with wood paneling that had seen better decades and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my attorney, Catherine Mills, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in probate disputes and had a reputation for demolishing opposing counsel with surgical precision. "Remember," Catherine whispered as we watched the defense team set up their materials, "this isn't about revenge. This is about justice and your family's financial security. Don't let Morrison bait you into emotional responses." I nodded, adjusting my conservative navy suit, one of 3 I'd purchased for these proceedings with money I couldn't really afford. Emma and Michael sat in the gallery behind me, having been excused from school to attend what their guidance counselor had euphemistically called important family business. James Morrison, Sophia's attorney, looked confident as he arranged his files. He was representing not just Sophia, but David's estate and the validity of all his final legal decisions. Beside him sat Sophia herself, wearing a black dress that was appropriately somber but couldn't hide the fact that she looked like she'd lost 20 pounds in the past 2 months. We hadn't spoken since our coffee shop confrontation, but true to her word, she had provided a detailed affidavit about David's mental state in his final months. The document painted a picture of a man increasingly consumed by paranoia, guilt, and medication-induced mood swings, exactly what we needed to prove mental incapacity. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Chen," the bailiff announced. I couldn't help but notice the irony that a Judge Chen would be deciding the fate of our case against Sophia Chen. Catherine had assured me there was no relation, but the coincidence felt loaded with significance. Judge Chen was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of piercing gaze that suggested she'd heard every lie and excuse the legal system had to offer. She reviewed her notes briefly before addressing the courtroom. "We're here today to consider the petition of Margaret Whitmore to contest the last will and testament of Professor David Whitmore on the grounds of mental incapacity at the time of signing. Ms. Mills, you may present your opening statement." Catherine stood with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Professor David Whitmore was not of sound mind when he executed the documents that stripped his wife and children of their home and financial security. In the months preceding his death, Professor Whitmore was taking powerful psychiatric medications, experiencing severe anxiety and depression, and engaging in increasingly erratic behavior that culminated in legal decisions no rational person would make." She gestured toward our table stacked with evidence. "We will demonstrate that Professor Whitmore was suffering from what his own psychiatrist diagnosed as severe anxiety disorder with depressive episodes, complicated by guilt over serial extramarital affairs that he knew could destroy his career and reputation. In this compromised mental state, he made a series of legal decisions that were designed not to provide for his loved ones, but to hide assets and protect himself from the consequences of his own misconduct." Morrison rose for his response, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair making him look like he'd stepped out of a legal drama. "Your Honor, the defense will show that Professor Whitmore was a highly intelligent, methodical man who made careful, considered decisions about his estate. The plaintiff's allegations of mental incapacity are based on nothing more than her understandable grief and anger at discovering her husband's legitimate desire to provide for someone he truly loved." He turned slightly toward Sophia, who kept her eyes fixed on her hands. "Professor Whitmore's relationship with Ms. Chen was not casual or impulsive. It was a deep, committed partnership that he chose to honor through his estate planning. The fact that this causes pain to his first family does not invalidate his legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit." Judge Chen nodded at both attorneys. Ms. Mills, call your first witness. The state calls Dr. Elizabeth Harper. Dr. Harper was a woman in her early 40s with the kind of professional demeanor that inspired confidence. She took the witness stand and was sworn in with practiced efficiency. Dr. Harper, Catherine began, how did you come to know Professor David Whitmore? He was referred to me by his primary care physician in March of last year for treatment of anxiety and depression. Can you describe his mental state during your sessions? Dr. Harper consulted her notes. Professor Whitmore presented with symptoms of severe anxiety disorder, including panic attacks, insomnia, obsessive thoughts, and what he described as overwhelming guilt about personal decisions he had made. He was particularly focused on fears about professional consequences and the impact his choices might have on his family. Did you prescribe medication? Yes. I prescribed alprazolam for immediate anxiety relief and sertraline for long-term management of his depressive symptoms. Both medications can affect cognitive function, particularly decision-making ability and impulse control. Catherine moved closer to the witness stand. In your professional opinion, Dr. Harper, was Professor Whitmore mentally competent to make major legal and financial decisions during the period you were treating him? Morrison shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation beyond the witness's expertise. Overruled. The witness may answer based on her professional observations. Dr. Harper chose her words carefully. Professor Whitmore was experiencing significant psychological distress that, in my professional opinion, would have impaired his ability to make rational, long-term decisions. He was fixated on immediate problems and seemed unable to consider the broader consequences of his actions. This is consistent with someone in acute psychological crisis. Thank you, Dr. Harper. No further questions. Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. Dr. Harper stood by her assessment, and her credentials were impeccable. The state calls Detective Sarah Reeves. Detective Reeves took the stand and methodically outlined David's pattern of relationships with students, the systematic way he had compartmentalized his life, and the increasing desperation of his final months as he struggled to keep his secrets from colliding. Based on your investigation, Detective Reeves, what was Professor Whitmore's mental state in the weeks before his death? He was paranoid, anxious, and increasingly irrational. According to Ms. Chen's statement, he was convinced that his affairs were about to be exposed. He was taking medication that he hadn't disclosed to his cardiologist, and he was making financial decisions that seemed designed to hide assets rather than provide for anyone's genuine welfare. Morrison's cross-examination focused on the fact that David's behavior, while unethical, wasn't necessarily illegal, but Detective Reeves held firm. The pattern of behavior suggested someone whose judgment was severely compromised. The state calls Sophia Chen. The courtroom went dead silent as Sophia walked to the witness stand. She looked fragile and young, but there was a new strength in her posture that hadn't been there in the coffee shop. Ms. Chen, Catherine began gently, how would you describe Professor Whitmore's behavior in the final months of his life? Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the quiet courtroom. He was falling apart. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He was obsessed with the idea that someone was going to expose our relationship. He kept saying he had to protect me, had to make sure I would be okay if anything happened to him. Did his behavior seem rational to you? No, he was paranoid, constantly checking his phone and email. He would have panic attacks in the middle of the night, convinced that his career was over, that he would lose everything. He started talking about death constantly, about what would happen after he was gone. Catherine walked closer to the witness stand. Ms. Chen, did Professor Whitmore ever tell you about other relationships he had with students? Morrison objected, but Judge Chen allowed the question. No, Sophia said, tears beginning to fall. He told me I was the only one, that what we had was special, but I've since learned that wasn't true. He had the same relationship with at least 3 other women, using the same words, making the same promises. In your opinion, was Professor Whitmore mentally competent when he signed the documents leaving you his estate? Sophia looked directly at me for the first time since taking the stand. No. He was desperate, paranoid, and medicated. He wasn't thinking clearly about the consequences of his actions. He was just trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint Sophia as a vindictive young woman turning against her lover's memory, but she held to her story with quiet dignity. The state calls Margaret Whitmore. Taking the witness stand felt surreal, like stepping outside my own life to observe it from a distance. Catherine guided me through my testimony. 22 years of marriage, David's increasing distance and secretiveness, my complete ignorance of his other life. Mrs. Whitmore, did your husband ever tell you he was taking psychiatric medication? No, he hid it completely. He was hiding everything. The affairs, the medication, the debt he was accumulating to support his secret life. Were you aware that he had removed your name from the house deed? He told me it was routine paperwork for refinancing. I trusted him completely and signed without reading the documents carefully. I had no idea he was systematically removing me from our shared assets. Morrison's cross-examination was predictably aggressive. He tried to paint me as a bitter wife who had driven her husband to seek comfort elsewhere. But Catherine had prepared me well. I stuck to the facts: David's deception, his hidden mental health treatment, and the impossibility of informed consent when one party is being systematically lied to. The state rests, Your Honor. Morrison's defense was brief and focused on David's legal right to dispose of his property as he chose. He called character witnesses who testified to David's professional reputation and intellectual acuity. But he couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence we had presented about David's compromised mental state. In her closing argument, Catherine was devastating. Your Honor, Professor David Whitmore was a sick man making decisions based on fear, guilt, and medication-induced impairment. He systematically deceived his wife while restructuring their shared assets to hide his misconduct. This is not the behavior of someone acting with full mental capacity. This is the behavior of someone in psychological crisis. Morrison's closing was polished but hollow. He had no answer for the medical evidence, no explanation for David's pattern of deception, no justification for decisions that left a loyal wife and 2 teenagers homeless while enriching a young woman who had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had. Judge Chen announced that she would render her decision in 1 week. The longest week of my life crawled by. I tried to prepare myself for the possibility that we might lose, that David's final betrayal might stand unchallenged by the legal system. But when we returned to court, Judge Chen's expression was unreadable. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, she began, I find that the petitioner has met the burden of proof required to demonstrate that Professor David Whitmore was not of sound mind when he executed the contested documents. My heart stopped. Emma grabbed my hand so tightly I thought she might break my fingers. The evidence clearly shows that Professor Whitmore was suffering from severe mental health issues that were inadequately treated and hidden from his family and medical providers. His pattern of deceptive behavior, combined with his undisclosed psychiatric medication, created a condition of mental incapacity that invalidates his final will and testament. Judge Chen looked directly at me. The court hereby nullifies all estate documents executed by Professor David Whitmore in the 6 months preceding his death, including, but not limited to, his last will and testament, property transfers, and insurance beneficiary changes. The estate shall be distributed according to Connecticut intestacy law, with the surviving spouse receiving her legal share and the minor children receiving their protected interests. The courtroom erupted. Emma and Michael were crying and hugging me simultaneously. Sophia sat perfectly still, staring at her hands, while Morrison frantically scribbled notes for what would undoubtedly be an appeal. But we had won. After 3 months of homelessness, uncertainty, and legal warfare, we had won. As we left the courthouse, Sophia caught up with me on the steps. Margaret, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, I'm glad you won. David's children deserve better than what he left them. What will you do now? I asked. Start over, I guess. Figure out who I am when I'm not living someone else's life. She paused, then added, Thank you for helping me see the truth about David. It was painful, but I needed to know. I nodded. Take care of yourself, Sophia. You're young enough to build a real life, not just live in the shadow of someone else's lies. As she walked away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. The war was over, and all of David's victims, including Sophia, could finally begin to heal. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our reclaimed home, watching the morning sunlight stream through windows that were mine again. The house felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because I had changed. The woman who had signed away her property rights in blind trust was gone, replaced by someone who read every document, questioned every decision, and never again confused love with submission. Emma was scrambling eggs at the stove, humming something she'd learned in her school's spring musical. She had grown 3 inches since David's funeral, as if freedom from the weight of family secrets had allowed her to literally stretch toward her full potential. Michael sat at the breakfast bar, reading acceptance letters from colleges that had once seemed financially impossible. Mom, he said, looking up from a packet from Boston University, are you sure we can afford this? I smiled, pouring coffee into the mug that had once been David's favorite. Reclaimed, like everything else in our lives. We can afford it. The life insurance settlement came through last week. It had taken months of legal maneuvering, but Catherine Mills had successfully argued that David's insurance policies should also be restored to their original beneficiaries. The company had initially resisted, but faced with evidence of mental incapacity and fraud, they had quietly settled rather than face a public trial. The money wasn't just about financial security. It was validation that David's victims deserved justice, not just legal victory. My phone rang, displaying a number I now recognized. Jennifer Walsh, the first of David's former students to contact me after the trial. Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Jennifer. How are you? Better, much better actually. I wanted to let you know I got the job. Jennifer had been one of several women who had found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences after our court victory made headlines. She was now working as a victim's advocate with the State Attorney General's office, helping other women navigate situations involving abuse of power. That's wonderful. You'll be amazing at that work. I learned from the best, she said. Speaking of which, have you given any more thought to the foundation idea? Over the past months, several of David's victims had approached me about starting a foundation to help students who had been sexually or emotionally exploited by professors. The university had quietly settled several lawsuits and implemented new policies, but we all knew that individual cases were just symptoms of a much larger problem. I have, actually. I think we should do it. Really? I looked around my kitchen, at my children who were finally beginning to seem like teenagers again instead of refugees, at the home we had almost lost to one man's selfish decisions. Really? David spent years using his power to hurt young women. Maybe it's time to use our power to help them. After I hung up, Emma turned from the stove with a plate of perfectly scrambled eggs. Mom, are you going to start working again? It was a question I'd been avoiding for months. Before David, I'd been a promising graduate student in psychology, but I'd abandoned my career to support his academic ambitions and raise our children. At 48, the idea of starting over professionally was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'm thinking about it, I said. Maybe finish my doctorate, work with trauma survivors. You'd be good at that, Michael said quietly. You understand what it's like to have your whole life turned upside down. He was right. The woman I'd been before David's death, trusting, passive, willing to subsume her own identity for the sake of family peace, was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, more skeptical, but also more compassionate. I understood now what it meant to be betrayed by someone you trusted completely, to have your reality demolished by the discovery that everything you believed was a lie. That understanding, painful as it had been to acquire, was something I could use to help others. The doorbell rang, and Emma went to answer it. I heard familiar voices in the hallway, Detective Reeves and Dr. Harper, who had become unlikely friends during the long months of legal proceedings. I hope we're not intruding, Dr. Harper said, as they entered the kitchen. Sarah wanted to give you an update on the investigation. Detective Reeves looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen her, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into one of our kitchen chairs as if she belonged there. We've identified 2 more women, she said without preamble, both from earlier in David's career, both following the same pattern. The university is quietly reviewing his entire employment history. How many does that make total? 8 so far, maybe more. The university is offering counseling services and legal support to anyone who comes forward. 8 women, possibly more. I tried to imagine the scope of David's deception, the careful compartmentalization required to maintain so many relationships simultaneously. It was like discovering I'd been married to a complete stranger. There's something else, Detective Reeves continued. The university is implementing new policies about professor-student relationships, mandatory reporting requirements, clearer boundaries, better support systems for victims. They're calling it the Whitmore Protocol. I wasn't sure how I felt about David's name being associated with protections for the kind of women he had victimized, but if it prevented other young women from going through what Sophia and the others had experienced, I supposed I could live with the irony. Have you heard from Sophia lately? Dr. Harper asked. A few weeks ago. She's doing well, back in school, getting her teaching certificate. She wants to work with high school students, help them navigate college applications and career decisions. Sophia had surprised everyone by becoming one of the most vocal advocates for the new university policies. Her testimony to the Board of Trustees had been devastating and deeply personal. A young woman's account of how easily a trusted authority figure could manipulate someone's entire life trajectory. She's brave, Emma said from across the kitchen. It can't be easy to talk about all that stuff in public. Bravery is what you do when you're scared, but you do it anyway, I said. Sophia is choosing to turn her pain into purpose. That takes real courage. Michael looked up from his college brochures. Is that what you're doing, Mom? Turning pain into purpose? I considered his question. For months after David's death, I had been consumed by anger, grief, and the desperate need for justice. But somewhere along the way, those feelings had transformed into something more constructive, a determination to ensure that other families didn't suffer the way we had. I'm trying to, I said finally. Your father made choices that hurt a lot of people, but we get to choose what we do with that pain. We can let it make us bitter, or we can use it to make things better for others. Detective Reeves finished her coffee and stood to leave. You know, when I first met you at the funeral, you seemed like you might just fade away. Like David's death might be the end of your story too. Instead, it was the beginning, Dr. Harper added. You found strength you didn't know you had. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a normal family breakfast. Coffee cups, toast crumbs, college brochures, and the comfortable chaos of people who belonged together. Through the window, I could see the small garden I'd started planting last month, replacing David's pristine lawn with something wild and colorful and entirely my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Mills. Media interview request from 60 Minutes. Interested in discussing systematic abuse of power in academia. Worth considering? I stared at the message, knowing that agreeing would mean exposing our family's most painful experiences to national scrutiny. But it would also mean that David's story, all of it, including the parts he'd tried so hard to hide, could serve as a warning to other potential victims and their families. I typed back, yes, set it up. Emma appeared at my shoulder, reading over my arm. You're going to be on TV? Maybe. Is that okay with you and Michael? She considered this seriously, her 17-year-old face thoughtful. Dad spent years lying to protect himself. Maybe it's time someone told the truth to protect other people. That evening, after Michael and Emma had gone upstairs to do homework, I walked out to the small patio David had built behind our house. He had imagined us growing old here together, drinking wine and watching grandchildren play in the yard. Like so many of his plans, it had been a beautiful lie. But I was here anyway, not with the life I had planned, but with a life I was actively choosing. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone, but in her place was someone who trusted carefully, loved wisely, and fought fiercely for the people and principles that mattered. My phone rang. Linda, calling from Boston as she did every evening now. How was your day, little sister? Good, I said, and realized I meant it. Really good. I think I'm going to go back to school. At 48? At 48. Maybe finish my doctorate. Become a therapist, help people who've been through trauma. That's perfect for you, Linda said immediately. You always were the one who wanted to fix everyone's problems. Not fix, I corrected. Help them find their own strength. There's a difference. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood settling in for the night. Somewhere across town, Sophia was probably studying for her teaching exams, transforming her pain into purpose, just as I was. Jennifer was preparing for her new job, helping other victims find justice. Amanda and Rebecca and the other women David had deceived were rebuilding their lives on foundations of truth instead of lies. David had thought he could control all of us, even from beyond the grave. He had thought his careful planning and legal maneuvering would allow him to continue manipulating our lives after his death. He had been wrong. I pulled out my phone and started typing an email to the admissions office at the university where David had taught for so many years. They had a doctoral program in clinical psychology with a specialty in trauma therapy. The application deadline wasn't for 3 months, but I wanted to get started immediately. I was 48 years old, starting over from nothing, building a life on the ruins of 22 years of marriage to a man I'd never really known. 6 months ago, that would have terrified me. Tonight, it felt like freedom. As I hit send on my admissions inquiry, I thought about the garden I was planting, the seeds that would grow into something beautiful and entirely my own. David had tried to transplant me into soil where I would wither and disappear. Instead, I had learned to bloom where I chose to plant myself. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but full of possibilities that were entirely mine to explore. For the first time in my adult life, I was the author of my own story, and I was just getting started.